Jimmy Carter was the first president to be born in a hospital. During the Revolutionary War, future President Andrew Jackson was taken hostage by the British and he was beaten pretty bad, making Andrew Jackson the only president to be a prisoner of war. William Henry Harrison became the first president to die in office after contracting likely cholera in 1841. He died at the age of 68. In the 1890s, then, his grandson Benjamin became president, where he then died at the age of 68. At the end of the Civil War, a photo was released to the American general public of General Ulysses S. Grant smoking a cigar. And he wasn't really much of a smoker, he was more of a drinker. However, the American people, not knowing this, sent the general loads of cigars, and then Grant felt kind of bad if he didn't chain smoke them all, eventually contracting throat cancer and dying in 1885. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson was at war with Vietnam. Not him personally fighting the whole army, it was the country's army, but, anyways, Lyndon Johnson claimed that there was a massive impressment of American sailors by Vietnamese ones. This became known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Lyndon Johnson then lied about it to Congress, saying that it did happen, when in fact it did not. Almost unanimously, Congress approved the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and Lyndon Johnson signed the bill on my birthday. George Washington may be remembered today as a great politician and president. However, by every account, he was a horrible general. Early Democratic presidents, and when I mean that, I mean presidents from before the Civil War that represented the Democratic Party, had a really hard time having children, and if they did, keep them. Andrew Jackson had no biological children and only adopting children, both of whom were First Nations. Martin Van Buren is the exception here. James Polk had no children. Franklin Pierce did have children, however, they were all killed before the age of 12, and James Buchanan never even married in the first place. Abraham Lincoln was a great president and a great politician as well. However, one thing that he was definitely better at than politics was wrestling. He only lost one game in his entire wrestling career, and the opponent may have cheated to have won that game. Therefore, he is currently in the Wrestling Hall of Fame. Gerald Ford was an excellent football player and had to both turn down two offers to the NFL from the Detroit Lions and the Green Bay Packers. And he ended up becoming a president, as that's why I'm talking about him. Historically, the best route to becoming president of the United States is to serve in the military. However, of the last five presidents, all of them did not serve in a war, but four of them didn't even serve in the military at all. Two American presidents have died at the age of 60: loud, outdoorsy, and extroverted Theodore Roosevelt, and quiet, timid, and taciturn Calvin Coolidge. When Franklin Roosevelt died in office in April 1945, it was the only presidential death from January 5th, 1933, with the death of Calvin Coolidge, to November 22nd, 1963, with the assassination of John F. Kennedy. At the end of Grover Cleveland's first non consecutive term, Grover Cleveland was initially intent on just retiring back to public life and shutting the heck up about politics for a little while. His wife Frances, though, was not so keen. Reportedly, she told one of the people on the way out to leave everything that the way that they have found it on that day, for they will be back in 4 years. And her prediction came true. On July 4th, 1776, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence gets adopted. Exactly 50 years later, on July 4th, 1826, both of them die. Before he turned 50 years old, nobody had even heard about Harry Truman. He was just lucky to get a Senate seat, and by that, somehow, the vice presidency. Upon Roosevelt's death, he became the president. James Madison was the only president to lead troops during battle during an actual war. George Washington led troops to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. However, James Madison actually led troops to battle during the War of 1812. Speaking of James Madison, he was a really small guy. He was only 5'4" and weighed less than 100 pounds. A United States president has made 34 presidential visits to Mexico, started all the way back in 1909 when William Howard Taft visited the country, which was only the second time the sitting president ever left the country. John Adams was the longest lived United States president from 1803 to 2001 when Ronald Reagan finally surpassed him. Woodrow Wilson was the first president to screen a movie at the White House, that being Birth of a Nation, a racist KKK film in which Woodrow Wilson dubbed historically accurate. Chester Arthur wasn't elected to any position in his life until he was elected as Vice President of the United States. He only assumed the office of President following the assassination of James Garfield. Born on the 20th of November 1942, Joe Biden was born closer to Abraham Lincoln's second inauguration in 1865 than to his own in 2021. The 1876 election was the closest electorally in American history, where Republican Rutherford Hayes beat Democrat Samuel J. Tilden by one electoral vote. John Quincy Adams was an absolute smart president, being fluent in English, French, German, and Latin, and speaking enough Dutch, Ancient Greek, Italian, Spanish, and Russian to get around. While on the talk of multilingualism, Herbert Hoover could speak Mandarin Chinese. Two American presidents have served a total of 6 years, Calvin Coolidge and Lyndon Johnson, both of whom absolutely shocked the nation when they refused to seek a second full term. The first president to start the ceremonial first pitch of the baseball season was William Howard Taft back on April 14th, 1910. James Buchanan never married, and his first lady was his niece, Harriet Lane. However, James Buchanan isn't the only president whose wife did not serve as first lady. Well, because Buchanan never had a wife, first of all, but other presidents' wives may have died, like Thomas Jefferson, for whom first lady duty was carried out by his niece, Martha Jefferson. The 1960 presidential election, fought between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, was all about experience coming out of the Richard Nixon camp. However, the only thing separating Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy was Richard Nixon had served as vice president for 8 years, because John F. Kennedy had served in the Senate and in the House for as long as Nixon had. Despite coming from a really, really high social status, George Herbert Walker Bush during the Great Depression did not discriminate against the poor kids. In fact, his mother made sure that he would give half of his sandwiches every lunch to the poorer kids who couldn't afford lunch because, well, it's the Great Depression. Despite being the last of the Virginia dynasty, James Monroe actually died and was initially interred in New York City. Martin Van Buren was the only president for whom English was not his first language. In fact, that would be Dutch. Martin Van Buren died in 1862, the same year as John Tyler, who just the year before had sided against the country he had served as president for to side with the Confederacy, and even got elected to the Confederacy's Senate. George Washington couldn't have any biological children of his own. However, he did have stepchildren. And if you keep looking down his family tree, you'll get to Robert E. Lee somehow. Calvin Coolidge was infamous for not being a man that spoke very often. However, he's also the president that called the most press conferences. The picture you're currently looking at is a picture of 7-year-old Theodore Roosevelt looking out of his window to watch the funeral procession for Abraham Lincoln in New York City. Zachary Taylor was a lifelong military man and independent. Few really knew what he stood for on political issues, and that was really important when he ran for president in 1848.